Welcome to DIA Today, Democracy in America Today. I'm Matt Parks alongside David Corbin. Glad to have you listen to explore the ideas behind this.
To my left I see pollution. Those dirty fuels are burning. The earth's whole climate's churning. Clean energy solution. My right eye scans the bill. Fossil fuels are cheap. Wind and solar too steep. Drill, baby, drill. Predefined, misaligned, polarized division. Shuttered mind, worse than blind. 2020 vision.
How you doing, Dave? I'm doing well. Yeah, I'm kind of in the new perch, so to speak. I don't know if it's a perch, but fourth day of work at Colorado Christian. It's been great thus far, although like any new job, you just don't know where everything is. You don't know
Right.
how to sign in. You don't know the right angles when you're walking on campus, et cetera. So
Yeah.
everything takes, 1.5 times the amount of time it usually would take. So
Right.
I'm going to take it easy on myself and kind of give myself that wiggle room. So, but
Yeah.
yeah, it's been great. Nice welcome. Really met some great faculty and other administrators. So it's been good. It's exciting.
Yeah. No, that's very exciting. No, it's appreciate you giving me a little bit of the tour out the window there. It looks like you got a nice spot on campus.
If you're ever out in Colorado, come visit. We're in Lakewood, which is a little west of Denver, about 5 miles west of Denver.
No, I know. I don't have the mindset of college campuses from Kings. You got
Yeah.
3 floors on this building and a couple floors on that building and a walk in between. But yeah, it's neat to see a traditional campus there and
Yeah.
it's a school that's growing and doing well. So
Yeah, really is. It's that is the one thing that I missed when I left Providence is that kind of energy of 18 to 25-year-olds.
Yeah.
It's a neat feeling. The only bad effect of that is you continue to think that you're like 25 or 30, and then you just get older, and you're like, "Oh,
I know.
54, what's going on here?"
Yeah.
So
Yeah, I still remember my first experience of that when I was teaching at UNH because I started teaching. You got me a gig the last minute before a semester started when one guy went off to work at Euro Disney. And
yeah,
so I was coming in
you
there.
were like 16 years old too,
Well,
right?
I was 23. Yeah, and I
Right.
was teaching at UNH Manchester, which is non-traditional students. So they were all older than me. I
Yep.
think almost every one of them. And so, yeah, okay, well, I'm teaching my peers. They're going to have common reference points with me. And then within about 5 years, I started having all these students misspelling Ronald Reagan's name on their exams. And I
It's
thought,
rough.
what kind of idiots am I teaching here? How could you not know Ronald Reagan? I mean, every single day in the newspaper and the headlines. And I realized, oh, wait, no, not these guys. Right. And so every year, that gap between you and your students grows just a little bit,
Yeah.
and the reference
Yeah.
points change. And you realize, okay, yeah, we're not really of the same generation anymore. I'm gonna have to explain some of my old man ideas and references.
Yeah, and then you start having children like I do, and
Yep.
now they're in graduate school, getting married, and you're like, "Whoa, what's going on
Yeah,
here?" So
right. That's right. That's
all
right.
good.
Well, good. So last time we were looking at the relatively quiet period of the early 1770s. We said 71, 72 were years where there wasn't quite as much activity, at least it didn't appear to be, although there were still ideas percolating in Boston, as we saw. But the Townshend Acts that had been the last group of objectionable laws from the American standpoint had been passed by that point about 4 years before, and on the taxing side, at least all had been repealed except for the tax on tea. And so by the time you get to 1773, the British East Indies Company, which had a major business in tea, was in economic trouble. And so the Parliament decided what they wanted to do was to basically create a monopoly in favor of that company that would lower the price of tea in America, ironically, but also assert the power to create monopolies. And so this is kind of a test. One of the questions people ask about the American Revolution is, well, was it just a tax revolt? They just didn't want to pay their
Mhm.
taxes? And this is one of those data points that pushes back in the opposite direction because here they're actually getting a break on the price of tea, but they were concerned with the principle, which was being asserted, that the British Parliament could establish a monopoly, could forbid them trading with the Dutch, who were the other parties often involved in the tea trade. So there's a general response to this of non-importation, which was a tool they had used before in response to Townshend Acts. Okay, we're not going to import goods. We're going to use home supply, and that'll hurt British trade, and hopefully that'll put economic pressure on the Parliament to repeal the laws. And so city to city, up and down the East Coast, they turn away these ships as they're coming with this tea. But in Boston, the governor insists that the tea be offloaded. So rather than just saying, okay, fine, we'll turn the ships away, send them back where they came from, we don't want to start trouble, the governor in Massachusetts says, no, you know what, on principle, we're going to have that tea be offloaded. Well, it does get offloaded, as we all know, but not the way he envisioned. December 16th, 1773, the Boston Tea Party, a relatively small number of patriots dress up as Native Americans and get on board and dump the tea into the Boston harbor there. And this really, really angers the British establishment back in England. And so they decide once and for all they're going to crush the rebellion in Boston. And so they pass a series of laws which Americans call the Intolerable Acts. And the most important of these, and the first one that was passed, was called the Boston Port Act, which was passed in late March 74, in effect as of June, which closed the Boston port to all ships and moved the state capital, or the colonial capital, out of Boston further west in Massachusetts. And so really major economic and political consequences from that law. They're not done because in May, they pass a law that revokes the colonial charter of Massachusetts. And so in a sense, there's no government anymore for Massachusetts except that which the governor appoints and dictates. And so rather than having elections for officials, which was the custom, now it's the governor who is appointing the executive council and even town officials. We know, of course, Dave, from our experience up in New Hampshire, the classic New England town meeting. Mm-hmm. All those are shut down. Can't happen unless the governor calls it, except for the single annual meeting. So basically, you're back in a state of nature. Right? You're back in a situation where you've got anarchy, and the only authority there is the arbitrary authority of the governor. Right? Two more laws that are passed in connection with all this. One that allows for the trial of British officials back in England rather than locally in Boston or elsewhere in the colonies. And then a Quartering Act, which allows British soldiers to be housed in unused buildings, again, up and down the colonies. So this, I think, is really the critical moment for the Americans as a group. Right? Because the question is Boston just getting the medicine they deserve? If we close Boston Harbor and I live in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, do I just say, wonderful, right? Ships come right up here. We will take that business and we will prosper. Or I'm in New York City. I say, hey, look, Boston, you dug your own grave. We're going to do well down here. You want to turn things around. You want to be more respectful. You can get your port opened again. Is that the kind of response? Or will there be a sense of a national cause? This is really the critical moment in some ways that leads ultimately toward the revolution.
Yeah, as you go through that history, and that's great, just to realize month by month, year by year, how we began this series back in the 1760s, that there's a flow to this historical movement that interestingly proves the argument the Americans are making to be correct, or at least kind of legitimizes that much more. The key thing that you mentioned there is by preventing the colonies from having legislatures, you've basically reverted, as you said, to the state of nature. So here's where Locke comes into the picture once again. And what happens when you revert to the state of nature? Well, you go back to the main moral agent in this case, which is the American people, right? The people then decide. And a lot of what we're going to read moving forward will go back to go back to Locke's argument and make the case from a very clear starting point of the state of nature, just what rights people have. I think another thing that's interesting is that the Americans call these the intolerable acts. We never hear the word intolerable that much anymore. It's a great
Right.
word, though, right? That we're not going to tolerate this.
Right.
Something actually can be intolerable. We use the word unjust,
Hmm.
not right, but intolerable, and I think that's a neat word to use in this case.
Yeah.
I think it's also interesting too, right, that as you mentioned, that Boston Tea Party becomes a massive event and is used by the British as a reason to kind of clamp down and to pass these various acts. And you don't see a great embrace by a lot of the colonial leaders. In fact, in our notes, Washington says, and this is from McDougall's Great History of Early America, titled "Freedom Just Around the Corner." Once this all happens, Boston's cause now is and never will be considered as the cause of America. Not that we approve their conduct in destroying the tea. So, once again, a clear statement of what our rights are, a clear statement that what the British are doing is intolerable, and then an argument to follow. And I just love this, right? As teachers of political philosophy, that there's an argument that follows.
Yeah.
So let's get into that argument, a summary view of the rights of British America, written by Thomas Jefferson. He wrote this document to be instructions for the Virginia delegation that was be part of the Continental Congress that came into being. This is published in August. The Congress opens up September 5th of 1774. You've described the events of earlier that year.
Hmm.
So what's Jefferson's tone in writing? Where do we see his tone at the beginning of this document?
Well, on the one hand, he says it's appropriate to have a humble and dutiful address to the king, but it's really quite bold. It's
A little bit
something.
like Machiavelli writing to Medici at the beginning of Prudence.
There's a little bit of that because what he wants to do, and really this is the essence of the whole thing, is to assert a principle of manly equality. And say, well, we're not coming to you, King George, cap in hand. We're not asking for favors. We're not asking you to do us a solid because we did something good for you. We are asking for our rights and asserting our rights. We are not asking for anything that you have a right to withhold from us, but only asking you to acknowledge the reality of our situation and the things that follow from that. And he's really building this upon a natural law, natural rights foundation, which he says, look, anyone can read that book. Anyone can read the book of nature and understand what's right and what's wrong. And you, King George, have an obligation to do that. You have a position, you have power, but you're a human being, just like I am a human being. And so we're going to address you as a fellow human being who has political authority, but also has responsibility that goes along with that.
Yeah, this is right out of John Locke's playbook, because at the beginning of the Second Treatise of Government, he says,
Yeah.
well, a lot of people think that, all right, that the king has inherited a line of authority from the first man, Adam, and then Locke goes into the state of nature and says, no, that's not how we're going to look at
Yeah.
who a king is. A king is a human being who, like every human being, has been embedded with reason and hence is no greater or no less than any other man. Jefferson writes here, this document is going to reflect that the king is no more than the chief officer of the people, appointed by the laws and circumscribed with definite powers to assist in working the great machine of government, erected for the people's use, and consequently subject to the people's superintendence. That's kind of a slapdown. You're
That
part of a machine that works for us being the people.
that is not how the king sees himself. That's right. This is very much the theory of Locke and social contract more broadly, but this is definitely not how British kings saw their position.
I was gonna say, which sounds crazy, like in our day, because we don't have any respect for kings. Like it's not like, oh, King Charles, right? He's a better man than I do. But back
Right.
then, very, very different context for how we looked at nobility and majesty and all the rest.
Yeah. That's right. So then he begins to tell a story, and he just goes back and tells the story of the peopling of North America. And you'll see as you go through the history, as he records it, that he's really showing that America, as Locke himself claims it in his chapter on property, is basically the classic example of the social contract theory. America was essentially a state of nature. People came over on their own volition. The British government had nothing to do with it, didn't send them over, didn't supply them. They came over on their own dime or as part of groups of investors. They established themselves there at their own risk. Of course, many died, many suffered great deprivations, but slowly they began to establish themselves. They slowly began to build up local institutions. The population began to grow, and they developed their own governments, local assemblies, and these kinds of things. And so, although they were British in a certain sense, because they were mostly from Britain, and they were happy to acknowledge the king as their king, they thought of themselves as just an extension of the empire. They had no idea that they were somehow under the sovereign rule of the parliament, or that the king could simply give arbitrary commands to guide their lives. No, they were people that were self-governing and who had established themselves, again, by their own efforts, at their own price, at their own cost, in order to make a new home for themselves in America.
Yeah, and I think it's important here that Jefferson goes into a historical overview because oftentimes, rightly, we see the moral logic of the Declaration of Independence, but it's not just simply a moral logic that is theoretical here. There is a history involved, and that history not only takes into account the settlement of North America, but also takes into account the Glorious Revolution, British history,
Yeah.
and to undercut the king's authority. That there have been, at times, princes who have done the wrong thing, who even, he says, have committed treasonable crimes. So he uses history not only to reinforce the American position that Americans are deserving of the property they've acquired and coming to the New World, but that princes, as people, can commit crimes and be unjust like any other people. So I think
Yeah.
it's a really strong argument here at the beginning, based upon history, though, that will tend right and be reinforced by the moral logic
Hmm.
of all men being created equal and natural law. But history combined with philosophy is a very powerful argument.
You might be pushing back, imagining a pushback by British authorities to what Jefferson's claiming. Say, wait a second, we have these colonial charters. We established governments for you, and we divvied out land. And he says, well, who did that? A lot of those were done by those very kings or those lines of kings that were deposed in the Glorious
Mhm.
Revolution. Yeah, sure. There were treasonous acts that were committed. There were unjust claims. There were restrictions on their navigation. We've mentioned briefly before the navigation acts of the middle of the 17th century, which were rather severe. And so you say, well, look, Parliament claimed power over their navigation, over their trade back in the 17th century. Nothing new when it comes to the Townshend Acts or the Tea Act. But Jefferson says, no, but those were unjust actions. Those weren't rightful. And we objected at the time, not maybe the same way that we are now, but we objected at the time. We worked around those laws. We challenged the authority of the Parliament and the king to assert this kind of control over us.
Yeah, and here you see a foreshadowing of the language at the beginning of the Declaration, as he kind of goes through these various unjust acts, where Jefferson says, single acts of tyranny may be ascribed to the accidental opinion of a day, but a series of oppressions begun at a distinguished period and pursued unalterably through every change of ministers too plainly prove a deliberate and systematical plan of reducing us to slavery. And kind of summing it up all there. Yeah.
That's right. And so, yeah, this document in some ways is the beginning of his list of particulars. When you go through the Declaration of Independence, as we get there, Lord willing, in a few months, we're going to get to that list of 18 grievances, and a lot of them have reference points back to this document. I mean, he's been rehearsing this list over the course of years, thinking about the different ways in which the British government and the Crown in particular has abused its power. And so the Declaration gives a very quick kind of bullet point summary of these, but we have an elaboration of a number of these points here in this document. So it's great context. If you're ever reading the Declaration, you want to know more about what's he talking about here? What are they claiming? go back and read the summary review because Jefferson gives you a paragraph, or sometimes two paragraphs explaining it.
So, let's play devil's advocate here. Men as men can acquire property. What about the property that's dumped into the Boston Harbor? What does Jefferson have to say about that?
Well, he's not going to defend it, but the problem is they've decided to take the private acts of private individuals, let's say they're criminal acts, very justifiably so, perhaps, then prosecute them for them, right? Arrest people, try them, put them in jail. That doesn't justify shutting down the whole port of Boston, doesn't justify shutting down the entire government of Massachusetts. If 100 people are guilty, then arrest 100 people. It's not such a massive number of people or such a widespread rebellion that you can say this is really the whole of the people rising up. And again, we saw, as you quoted from George Washington, there were plenty of colonial leaders who distanced themselves from the Tea Party. And so wouldn't have objected, probably, if there had been individual prosecutions of those guilty parties. But they took that, and as far as Jefferson and Washington were concerned, used it as a pretext for a power over the people of Massachusetts that was unwarranted.
Yeah, and is a proper response by the British, and these are the words that Jefferson uses to paint the situation in Boston after that Tea Party. The whole of that antient and wealthy town is in a moment reduced from opulence to beggary. So that's not a good response. So, like you said, not defending those who dump the tea into the harbor, but wondering, okay, what now? So
Yep.
what does Jefferson expect of the king moving forward? What's the expectation? What is his hope?
Well, he does see the king as having an important role in this system. So again, Americans to this point have never denied that the king is their king, and that therefore the king has some rightful authority as part of the overall empire that they are members of. But what's happened is the British Parliament has been asserting over and over again an unrightful claim of authority over the American colonists. And Jefferson really refutes this at the most basic level. He says, look, this is just a foreign body trying to tell us what to do. They have power over their local situation, the people there in England, but they have no power over us. And it's incumbent upon the king to tell them that, in essence, to object to laws that assert parliamentary power over the American colonies. He makes this interesting argument concerning the equality of Americans to those folks in Britain. So there's about 160,000 people who are the voting class in the British Parliament at that point in time. There are 4 million people in America. That's men, women, children, black, white, that's everybody, 4 million people. And he says those two groups are equals, right? The individuals are equal, one to the other. And so there's no reason why that 160,000 people should be giving laws to the 4 million people of America. The 4 million people of America will give laws to themselves. Thank you very much. And it's the king's job to ensure that they have the opportunity to do that without the imposition of unjust authority by the parliament.
Yeah, here it seems that he understands executive power as just and right when it employs what you might call a magisterial veto on
Right.
the action of an unjust parliament. And here we have a presidential veto as well. So he's asking the king to exercise a negative power and prevent the passage, these are Jefferson's words, prevent the passage of laws by any one legislature of the empire, which might bear injuriously on the rights and interests of another. And he brings up an interesting example here, one that you rarely see in the argument over Jefferson the person and his position relative to the institution of domestic slavery. He notes here that Americans have wanted the abolition of domestic slavery, and in that case as well, the king hasn't played the part of his negative veto. Isn't that interesting, Matt?
Yeah, and the problem is that the king has not allowed laws that would have put restrictions on the slave trade, which Jefferson says is really the preliminary step before you can end slavery. You have to end the slave trade so you're not having more slaves coming over. That the king has been beholden to the interests of those who are involved in the slave trade, the British interest there, and prevented the American people from doing something about the slave trade. And so this is something that's going to be part of the story that Lincoln will eventually tell regarding American slavery. Right? Don't forget that while obviously Americans benefited from slave labor and Jefferson, among the foremost in that regard, nevertheless, it was the British who prevented the Americans from doing something about it at an earlier stage, which allowed slavery to become more entrenched, increased the number of slaves, and therefore increased the political interest associated with slavery. And so, very different story that perhaps it could have been told had the slave trade been ended 30 plus years earlier when there were many fewer slaves in America and the vested interests associated with slavery were not so powerful.
So you're reading this as a king or having it read to you, and you're like, what is he talking about? Doesn't he realize that all possessions in North America are mine, that I own this land, that you have a right, and this goes back to the age of feudalism, to possess as a noble the land that is there. What's Jefferson's response or retort to that?
Well, this is again, it's kind of pure lock. I mean, there's just no, you have no rightful claim from Westminster to the land over there in Virginia or Massachusetts. The people on the ground acquired it. They acquired it by conquest in some cases, by labor in other cases, but in any case, it's their land. And so there's no right of a king to impose some kind of inherent tax. Think about the granting of all of Pennsylvania to William Penn by the king. From Jefferson's perspective, that's kind of a laughable event. I mean, William Penn is now going to control an area which is larger actually than England. One man can just be bequeathed that land by a king. No, you can't do that. The people there will make claims and they'll work it out with Native American tribes where there's conflicts and they'll, settle among themselves. I mean, there will be plenty of justice that has to be meted out, but it won't be because the king has a right to establish terms upon which the people that live there can use and maintain their land.
Right. Land is allotted by labor, right? Property is assumed by work, and that's how something becomes one's possession. He also looks forward, as we're getting near the end of this document, to what might happen, and I think has happened in some degree in the quartering acts, in terms of sending over a military force into the United States. And he writes that His Majesty has no right to land a single armed man on our shores, and those whom he sends here are liable to our laws made for the suppression and punishment of riots, routs, and unlawful assemblies, or as hostile bodies invading us in defiance of law. That's really kind of that's going out there now. Like, okay,
Yeah.
you've now begun, right, to turn a page in this whole affair. You're beginning to employ force against us. Note that right and our laws supersede whatever force you bring here. And I think he's hinting, right, that if you do that, we're going to use the powers that we have to defend ourselves and to defend the law, that is the law of the land in our realm.
Yeah, and at the very least, we have the right to do that. Right? Again, the whole framework is that America is for the people of America. And the connection to the British crown is a voluntary one, chosen by the people on certain conditions. And if the king won't respect those conditions, then there's really no reason why the American people need to pay him any heed. And the parliament never had any authority over them as an independent people under the crown. And so, yeah, I mean, what's unfolding here is just a series of miscalculations by the British government based upon a faulty understanding of their relationship with the American colonies. The American colonies have an independence, not an entire political independence at this point, but a certain kind of independence that has to be respected and intrinsic authority that has to be respected by the crown and by the parliament if that relationship will continue.
Yeah, so like many of the documents we've covered over the last couple months, uh, Jefferson's letter ends with a plea, and I love the language of this plea. This, sire, is the advice of your great American council. on the observance of which may perhaps depend your felicity and future fame, and the preservation of that harmony which alone can continue both to Great Britain and America, the reciprocal, that word reciprocal, emphasizing equality, the reciprocal advantages of their connection. It is neither our wish nor our interest to separate from her. And goes on to say, do the right thing in this situation and we'll move forward. And that seems to be the tone of most of the individuals in the previous 10 years as these historical movements evolved. Do the right thing and we'll move forward, remain part of the realm, yet govern ourselves. So, Matt, we've covered this document. In sum, what are the key principles that Jefferson is relaying to the king?
Well, there's a number of them, but I think we can probably summarize them relatively quickly. There's a story about the American origins. That's at the heart of all this, as we were saying, a story about the history, an interpretation of the history. Americans came to America. They were exercising their natural right to leave their home country in search of a new home, and the British government had nothing to do with it. Once they arrived, they won title to their land by their labor, by conquest. And they don't owe that to the British crown or to the British military, even if the military has helped them at different points. That's as an ally, not as a master. They established local governments by consent, according to their own natural rights, and chose, in essence, the king to be their king. But that was a choice rather than something that was forced upon them by necessity. The king is meant to be a servant of them, as he is of the entire empire, and doesn't possess any arbitrary authority over them. And so he has an obligation to intervene to protect their natural rights and to make sure that the parliament isn't exercising authority over them that it doesn't rightfully have. Acts of that parliament are void, not because they're unjust, or not only because they're unjust, but even before that, because they're unauthoritative. The parliament, again, has no right to legislate for the American colonies. So even good laws, and even in some ways, the Tea Act, insofar as it lowered the price of tea in the Americas, you could say was a good law, but it was a faulty law. It was a law that had no authority because the parliament behind it had no authority over them. And while there's been a lot of violations of American rights over time, this period, as you were saying, Dave, has been in a period of accelerated offenses that are pointing toward an attempt to establish a tyranny over the American colonists. And so they're waking up to this reality. Of course, they had complained, they've worked around the laws in the past, but there's not been this pattern, this effort over now a decade's time almost to subdue them. And Americans are coming to realize that this is coming to a head. Just as you said, a month after he publishes this, the First Continental Congress meets, and all of a sudden you've got 12 of the 13 colonies gathering to talk about these common problems and to say with George Washington, what happened in Boston could happen to us. The cause of Massachusetts is the cause of America and not an isolated problem. We're not going to allow the British government to pick us off one at a time and to isolate us one from the other. Instead, we're going to come together around some common principles and common actions in order to defend our rights.
Yeah, and of course, and this is a good transition to the present day. We see one part of colonial history, which is the Revolutionary period, and then you're going to see the establishment of a government thereafter that is hopefully based on the principles that were used to declare our independence in the first place. So I think you see in Jefferson's argument an anticipation of the American constitutional separation of war powers, that you have a legislative branch, for example, that is holds the authority to declare war, to raise and support armies, to provide and maintain a navy, and regulate the armed forces, which is Article 1 of the Constitution, and then establishes the president as the commander-in-chief in Article 2 of those same armed forces. You see, there's very clearly within the American Constitution an argument for the right use of executive power, but a foundational suspicion of the wrong use of executive power, especially when it's initiating war. So, and here we are in March of 2026, And I mean, this has been the way of our country for the last 120 years as we take a much larger role in world affairs. This question of, okay, well, when we go to war as a country, how do we go to war? And what is the right way to go to war? What's the constitutional way to go to war? And I think that connects back what is the constitutional way for the king to act relative to the American colonies in the 1770s. So
Hmm.
it's interesting, right? And this isn't just simply, as I just mentioned, an issue of 2026 and our current administration, but back in 2014, when we were writing for the Federalist, we saw another example of an American president using some war actions for a stated goal, which, by the way, could be good, could be right. I mean, we're not arguing against that. But at that time, in response to the rise of ISIS, you had President Obama authorizing airstrikes in Iraq and Syria. And the argument was that this is part of the sustained counterterrorism campaign that's been in effect since 9/11. But in the speech that President Obama gives to the American people on September 10th of 2014, he says something really interesting. He encourages Congress to provide political authorization for something he's already done, saying that that would be beneficial, but not strictly necessary.
Right. And one of the things that comes out so clearly in Jefferson's essay is the danger of arbitrary executive power. And that's really the through line there. And that's the thing he's complaining of consistently by as you work your way through that series of paragraphs and complaints. So what's happening in 2014 is something of a lesser understanding of our constitutional system. And so, yeah, it'd be nice, President Obama says, if the Congress were to chime in support of his operations. But, at this point, if the executive wants it, the executive should get it. And this is something, again, that we see very plainly over the last decades. But, it's interesting to think about how far we've even gone from there to the present day. So President Trump has given no indication he wants Congress to give approval. He's not asked them to do that. He's not suggested that they do that. There's no effort in the Senate. Republicans lead the Senate. No effort in the House. Republicans lead the House to put together any kind of resolution in support of the war effort. He doesn't think he needs it. And for that matter, he's not even really given any kind of major speech. I think there was 10 minutes on Truth Social at the beginning of things, but really no effort to make a public case in favor of the conflict. And so very interesting to see. Remember in the second term, how President Obama said he was going to use his pen and his phone, right? Because there were Republicans that were controlling Congress, and so he wasn't going to be able to get laws passed. But that's okay because I have my pen and my phone, and I can use those means in order to accomplish my purposes. And so we saw at that point, this is a troubling development to think about just kind of arbitrary executive action without any kind of congressional authorization. What a surprise that a dozen years later, someone from the other party will take that up and say, oh, okay, very good. Then I guess we don't really need to worry about congressional authorization for these things. Why even give lip service to it? As long as I've got my pen and my phone, as long as I can give commands to senior leadership of the military, off they go. And the operation will go on my authority alone without Congress having any say on it one way or the other.
I can imagine the response, Matt, by some of our listeners who I think agree with the actions in Iran, and I actually, I'd love to get rid of that regime,
Right.
and I think it's a good thing, but the response would be, oh, you professors of political theory, you and all of your emphasis on, what authority lies where, and why do you make a big deal of, theory actually aligning with practice? Yeah, theoretically, the legislative branch ought to be the gatekeeper of war, but does it really matter at the end of the day when you want to get what you want to get and what you want to get is good? That was not the response by a more famous political theorist than us, George Will,
Yeah.
to the article that we wrote at the time titled Stopgap Statesmanship. George Will, in responding to our article, referenced what we suggested in that piece ought to be the way that we go to war as a nation, where number one, and we put this in the essay itself, a case for war is presented by the president to the Congress and by extension, the American people. Number two, an expression of popular support and the approval of the House of Representatives as the most democratic part of government. Number three, wise deliberation on wars, ends and means, especially in the Senate. And then finally, fourth, secrecy and dispatch in executing the resolution approved, led by the president, relevant cabinet members, and the military chain of command. George Will at that time said that's the way to do things. And that in the case of President Obama, that's not the way he's doing things, and hence what he's doing is wrong. We move now to March of 2026. Where's the new development with regard to war-making authority and a good and honorable man, George Will?
Well, there's a piece just yesterday in National Review Online by Brendan Dougherty, who talking about how Will has basically thrown up his hands and said, well, there's really nothing that Congress can do or needs to do with respect to this war in Iran. And, he cites kind of pragmatic considerations. Would it have been possible to have the element of surprise on the attack that originally knocked out Khomeini and others around him back on February 28th without, if there had been a public debate about the war and the timing of these things had been discussed? Well, no, we couldn't have done that. And so therefore, in order to accomplish our purposes, we have to give up on our constitutional system. I think it's surprising, honestly, from George Will, because he's usually better than that, and I think he knows better than that. You could have a debate at any point. You don't have to disclose the particular details of your operational plans, and you can still have plenty of elements of surprise and still have public discussion of a matter. And I think, honestly, that President Trump would benefit from this. Make the case, have that kind of debate, get people behind it, not in sort of a partisan way, well, because the president's our party, therefore we'll support him in whatever he does, or we support the troops because they're the troops and they're in harm's way, but actually make an argument that people can absorb themselves and restate themselves and begin to build a consensus around a certain set of ideas and objectives that will then lead the American people through the ups and downs of this conflict. I mean, because it's not been all triumph to triumph. The initial days were very successful, and the efforts to decapitate the regime obviously succeeded. But now we're beginning to wonder, where is this headed? And had there been a case made to the public and to the Congress in favor of whatever the goals were that President Trump has embedded in this action, and a consensus emerged in favor of those actions for those reasons, it would be easier to sustain public opinion through the challenges of gas prices going up and the beginnings of casualty lists and all the rest.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that we understand the argument, right? There is the element of surprise in war, and would that have been kept secret had plans been exposed through deliberation and debate? But there also have been acts passed by the U.S. Congress, most notably the War Powers Resolution of 1973, that were aiming to kind of have not a either or, but both, right? Where, okay, president can deploy armed forces in a certain part of the world, but he's got to report that to the Congress, I think, within 2 days.
Yeah.
And thereafter, that those troops, and there aren't troops on the ground right now, at least we don't think they are in Iran, but they would have to be removed within 60 days. So I think if you're using air power to lead an operation of regime change, maybe that doesn't fall under that war powers resolution. But all of that said, you've had many presidents that are like, that's not constitutional, for the Congress to require of me that I do X, Y, or Z.
Right.
Which is comical because, well, you want to use the Constitution as a standard in this case. Okay, what you're doing, right, is not meeting a constitutional standard.
Yeah, and I think this is just one of those things that we've become too accustomed to over the last century as the executive power has just grown and grown and grown, and the Congress has receded to basically a partisan support team. If the president is the same party as the members of the Congress or the majority in Congress, then they rally around the presidential flag. If it's not, they kind of hold out, waiting for the next presidential election and don't really do much but try to just bide their time. But there's not really any positive assertion of authority or power by the Congress. And we're worse for it because the Congress is designed to be a deliberative body. And if there's something our politics could use today, it would be some deliberation, some rehearsing of arguments, some effort to articulate reasons. I mean, think about what Jefferson wrote. This was meant to be a document that would be instructions for delegates to a Continental Congress back in 1774. This is a sophisticated document. It's a long document. There's a lot there. It wasn't approved as instructions. It was too radical for the group at the time. But think about that compared to the Twitter battles that we get, the Truth Social posts, and how impoverished our political debates and discussions are. And we think, well, that's just our times. But we're losing something. We're missing something when there's no arguments. Because the way that you build a movement, the way that you build a consensus, the way that you draw people in a popular government towards some measure of true self-government is through persuasion and making a case and showing people the reason of the thing that then guides them to good conclusions.
Yeah, and that's been something we mentioned in show after show after show that, okay, we have definitely moved in a direction where some could argue that we're beyond our Constitution or we're beyond our republic. But note that if we are beyond those two things, and we don't have the aid of persuasion and we don't have the willingness to debate and deliberate, that's a very different world that we're entering into. It's a politics that will not be ennobled. It's a politics that will tend to be life in the jungle,
Right.
where force rules and reason has no part in our interactions with one another. And, we've said this over and over again. We can vote for and like the fact that the people we voted for are in power. We can question the arguments of those who oppose what we believe in. But if we're not willing to debate with one another, it's pretty much lost.
Yeah. Yeah, that's right. And so we're going to see next time, Lord willing, we will move ahead just a month or two there and take a look at the declaration that did come out of that First Continental Congress. How did they, as a group, address the king and parliament and assert their rights? And we're going to see some pretty substantial parallels. Again, not quite so radical a statement, perhaps, as Jefferson gives us, maybe not as fundamentally grounded in Lockean theory, but nevertheless, key assertions about natural law and natural right, and some serious concerns about the future of the relationship. So, we're at that critical point, as we've said, where the consensus is beginning to form, where you can start to see the possibility of an independent United States emerging, but doesn't have to go that direction. There's an opportunity for some kind of reconciliation if the right voices can win the day over in Britain. And we'll get to that eventually as well. We'll look at Edmund Burke and his attempt to bring about conciliation. But things are beginning to move quickly now, and the pace of events is accelerating. The tension is rising. The conflict is deepening. And this is a time for clarity on what you believe and why you believe it. And we'll see the American colonists really striving for that over these next series of essays.
Yeah, and I think it's been the most fascinating thing in doing this season on the events leading up to the Declaration of Independence. It's not just, all right, the clock strikes midnight, July 4th, July 3rd, 1776, let the fireworks out and sign the paper. That this is an organic movement over 200 years, over 1,000 years. It's actually tied to the rest of human history that has kind of a unique importance based upon what plays out over 10 years. And going back to what you were saying before about Twitter versus history, historical thought going into historical circumstance, right? And, kind of ideas working their way out in institutions and thoughts about why we're here and how we live with one another correctly. All of those things go into this document that is really so unique in human history, because there was thought behind it, there was history behind it, there was leadership and statesmanship behind it as well.
All right, well, let's wrap the show up as we do week by week with Tocqueville's Crystal Ball. And last time, of course, we were making our predictions for the World Baseball Classic, which has been a lot of fun. I found myself getting into it more than I expected, but we didn't do that great, honestly, in terms of the four group leaders. Of course, our finalists are still alive, and although the U.S. had a bit of a scare with their loss to Italy the other night, they can still win the championship. So we'll see, but we both missed a few of the group winners. Canada surprising when we had both picked Puerto Rico. Of course, Italy over the U.S. in Group B. And then the last group, Dominican came through. I had the Dominican, you had Venezuela. All those teams are still alive, though, so we'll see what happens over the quarterfinals and semifinals and finals in the next couple of days.
I'm still shocked that Greenland didn't make it, that they didn't even have a team in the first place. So
next time. I mean,
next time.
yeah, it's an interesting mix because you've got the North American teams, you've got the key Asian powers, and then Czech Republic, showing up, clocking in, along with Great Britain, and then of course a lot of Central American teams. So yeah, it's been a good, I think, pretty competitive tournament. There's probably about 16 teams that are really competitive. Brazil kind of got blown away by everybody. Czech Republic was not really competitive. They were fun, but they weren't really competitive. But yeah, I mean, baseball is, it's established well now, I think, around the world, so that you can have a tournament like this and invite 20 teams and have it not be an embarrassment where every game until the, semifinals is 15-1 or over in 5 innings.
Who would ever thunk that Canadians can play baseball? Not so we'll see. But
Yep.
I need an upset by Venezuela over Japan to get
Yep.
my U.S. Venezuela final.
Yeah, it's possible.
All right. Well, one of our favorite times of the year,
Yep.
March Madness. We don't have a bracket, but you've suggested that for the Crystal Ball today, we choose our champion, our Cinderella team, and our top 10. I may have cheated here. I think I may have done top 12 team losing in the first 2 rounds. So
Yep.
let's go through each of these. Matt, your champion.
I got to go Duke. I know this is going to be difficult for you to swallow, but I mean, they've just been on such a tear with that one loss to North Carolina, accepted a few weeks ago, but they're dominant. So I think they run the table.
It's hard for me to do this as well. I have a new colleague I like a lot named Shannon, who's a big Duke fan, and
Okay.
Charlie Tapp, another great friend, is a Duke fan, and you know what I think about Duke, but I don't know how you can select any other team than Duke right now, just
Yeah.
given its overall makeup. So I'm going to go with Duke as a champion as well.
Okay.
My Cinderella, I'm going to go with Santa Clara.
Nice.
I think that they weren't able to win their conference championship against Gonzaga, but what's the name of the Gonzaga coach? He said that's going to be a good team. I wouldn't want to play them in the tournament. So
Yeah.
I'd say Santa Clara as my unranked team going far. How about yours?
I've got TCU. So my formula here is I want a team that's hot, that's beaten some good teams in the past, that has upperclassmen. Usually, you like to have a senior point guard or that kind of thing. They kind of check all those boxes. The point guard's a sophomore, but they've got a senior guard who plays opposite him and a junior front big man. So, yeah, they're just the kind of team that seems like they could make a run. I don't know, get to Elite Eight, something like that. And Big 12 has been tough this year, so it's not any shame to have lost 7 games in the Big 12. But I think they're poised to make a good run.
So just in case I invite you into the bracket I'm in, have you done like a data analytics on this and kind of run every team?
No.
Kind of with you? No? Okay.
No. I've not had time for any of that. But I was kind of scrolling down looking for a team that might fit that profile, and they've won their last 6 games in a row. I don't know, just certain things that I think would be
Okay.
indicative of a team that's likely to make it out of the first couple of rounds in the tournament.
Now, I know you have those abilities, so I would.
It's been done in the past.
Okay.
Different life, though. Yeah.
All right. Early out. So I said I might have cheated. I think they're ranked 12th or 13th, but I'm going to go with Kansas. I mean, at least they're a name team, with a storied past and,
Yeah.
possible number one pick in next year's draft. But
Yeah.
something's wrong in Kansas, and I see Kansas getting knocked out early. How about you? What team do you see getting
All
knocked
right.
out?
Well, I'm gonna pick one of their neighbors, Nebraska. And I think actually they're ranked 11th, so maybe neither of us followed my own
Okay.
rule on this one. But
Okay.
they started out 19-0. They was an incredible story early on. Since then, they've kind of been 500, a little better. So that's the kind of team that sometimes it just kind of falls apart. You whatever you had early in the season, the chemistry is no longer there, and so you lose in the first round. Maybe slip through the first round, lose in the second round. That's my expectation for Nebraska.
I'll tell you who I'm going to root for. I'm going to root for Miami of Ohio. I think their
Oh
season's
yeah.
been really remarkable, and yeah, that's kind of a fun story. So they'll be a team that I think if they can make it to the Sweet 16, it'll be interesting to see if they can win four and go undefeated. That would be remarkable. So
That would be neat. That would be neat. Brackets come out Sunday, so we'll see where all these teams land and what that looks like. By the time we have our next show, we'll be up to the Sweet 16 or so, which will be interesting. But in the meantime, grateful as always for you listening, and you can follow us on Instagram or YouTube. You can reach out to us at Democracy in America Today at gmail.com. By the way, our old friend Fred Lancia did reach out to us in the last week or two and sent us a new version of his song that we used to open and close the show. So really grateful for that. Great to reconnect with Fred. He's also got a Christian song that's come out that's beautiful that he wrote. It's a female singer, but really beautiful song, deeply embedded in the scriptures. So you can check that out as well. So we'll look forward to talking to you again soon, and enjoy the early days of the tournament.